in terms of some of the discretionary programs. So regarding the bipartisan infrastructure law, it is a once in a generation bill, and I got some information. Okay, so it's roughly about $550 billion in new federal infrastructure funding. It is the largest federal investment in public transportation. Also, in terms of passenger rail, and I think you all have heard about the dollars that have moved towards Amtrak. So it's also provided dollars with Amtrak. And then when you look at clean water, clean energy, and then as well as the investment in high-speed internet, it provides a substantial amount of investment in overall infrastructure. And when you look at things in terms of job creation, roughly about $2 million two million jobs per year are projected to be created per year. So looking just in general at the program, and that's $567.1 billion, and where those dollars are spread overall, the modes, when you look at Federal Highway Administration, in terms of our overall dollars, roughly about $303.5 billion in contract authority, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then another $47 billion from Congress in advance appropriations. So when you look at this program, it is a 5-year program which takes you through 2026. That $303 billion in contract authority is from the Highway Trust Fund. The other $47.3 billion is what Congress advanced from the general fund to be able to plus up the infrastructure investment. When you look at the new program, there are more than a dozen new programs, including formula programs tied to the administration's priorities in terms of resiliency, carbon reduction, bridges, electric vehicles, and then as well as the charging stations, and then overall infrastructure. There is billions of dollars of discretionary dollars available also, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the Reconnecting Community as well as the Safe Streets for All programs. But when you look at the discretionary programs with respects to bridges, EV charging stations, there's dollars put to our rural projects, as well as reconnecting communities. Now, the overall focus of the bipartisan infrastructure law was on safety, climate change, and then improving the project delivery process. The other big deal that this reauthorization program did is it put more dollars to local governments and other non-traditional entities. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. This is the first reauthorization program that really just exclusively points dollars to local communities, MPOs, and other authorities. And then the other big deal here for those that are either at state DOT or also within industry is there's a $90 billion transfer to the Highway Trust Fund. And so for years, we've been really operating under a system of where the Congress had to periodically plus up the Highway Trust Fund. Now we're at a point where over these next 5 years, there's more than enough dollars so we don't have to go into what we were doing before, getting relatively close to, which was a cash management approach in terms of our highway dollars. Now, when you look at the 9 categories under the Highway Infrastructure Program and the funding under bill, you can see where the dollars, where Congress really put those dollars to. So roughly about $27.5 billion into the Bridge Formula Program. That program launched off early January, February, and those dollars are available now to state DOTs to work on both rural as well as interstate bridges, and as well as what we're calling the all-system bridges to really make the impacts needed to bring our bridge infrastructure into a state of good repair. You can also see there's some discretionary dollars in terms of the bridge investment program, dollars towards the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, also known as NEVI. And I know you all have Angel Dean on the schedule, I think next month, to talk about the NEVI program with respect to Virginia. Each state is due to submit their infrastructure or their NEVI plan to Federal Highway Administration here within the next couple of weeks. Again, you can see there's investment dollars into the Reconnecting Communities pilot program, the ferry boat program, and then also into research. So again, significant dollars are put into the various programs to be able to improve the state of good repair, but also to right some wrongs that were previously done as part of the building of the infrastructure system. So one of the things I talked about a little bit earlier is how these dollars are spread out. So one of the things that this administration, as well as Congress, really wanted to do is really move those dollars just beyond state DOTs. We still want state DOTs to deliver the overall program. And so you can see here in front of you, when you look at the apportion program, the bridge program, et cetera, state DOTs will be responsible for delivering a good majority of those programs, whether they're formula or discretionary dollars. But also what you see is that there are several programs that are where MPOs, the locals, tribals, public authorities, territories, federal land management agencies, where they're actually eligible to these dollars as direct recipients. And so that's actually a big change, because it allows the locals and what we call our non-traditional stakeholders to prioritize where they want the dollars to go to be able to best help their communities or entities. So for example, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, the fourth one down is the Safe Streets and Roads for All discretionary program. That is a program where the state DOTs are not eligible per Congress. So they can help as far as providing some program management oversight, but in terms of being able to apply for that particular grant, they're ineligible. So that's one of the big deals here is with the bipartisan infrastructure law, is really allowing a lot of these local authorities to move from a sub-recipient category to a direct recipient. But what that does mean is there's going to be quite a bit of heavy lifting from our standpoint on the federal government, because we're going to have and also impact all you all also, because we'll have a lot of new entrants into really providing oversight to the federal program. So, right now we don't know what that means for Federal Highway Administration, but as far as the way we provide our stewardship and oversight, that's going to really change for us. What I want to do is just touch on a couple of things that from emphasis areas from this administration, and I'll touch on just some of the strategic objectives with US DOT. But in terms of safety, we did want to make some major improvements, some changes to the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and change some of the eligibilities for some of the specified safety projects, including some of the non-infrastructure safety projects that related to education, research, enforcement, emergency services, as well as safe routes to schools, to really start to spread those investment dollars so we could have more of an impact on safety, in particular when you look at our national road safety strategy in terms of the safe system approach. The other thing this bill did is require states to complete the vulnerable road user safety assessment. And then really, as I mentioned before, even with the eligibility, but taking into consideration the safe system approach when applying the vulnerable road user approach. So again, there's a big emphasis area in making sure that Highway Safety Improvement Plan really reflects where we want to go in terms of safety improvements. The same with the Rail Highway Crossing Program. There's some clarification on the funding eligibility for projects to really reduce pedestrian facilities or fatalities and injuries from trespassing at grade crossings, and to really improve those areas. That's been an area that's been neglected through MAP 21. We did try to make some improvements to the rail highway crossing program, but there was not enough investment dollars to really make the improvements necessary. In particular, when we look at our pedestrian fatalities and the significant increases in those numbers, again, particularly at these rail crossing and as well as the vehicle accidents at these rail crossings. So again, we want to really be able to make sure the investment dollars were there so that the state DOTs in partnership with the locals could really make some improvements at these rail highway crossings. There is also, in terms of safety, a new wildlife crossing pilot program. This is a discretionary program, and it supports projects that really seek to reduce the number of wildlife vehicle collisions and really to improve the habitat connectivities. There's a lot of states, particularly out west, but Virginia is also a candidate for this also, where wildlife crossing has been a major source of vehicle collisions. And so we really want to make sure those dollars were there again to reduce the wildlife vehicle collisions, and then making sure there were set aside projects for the rural areas. So we could, again, not just particular projects, but what else could we do in terms of studies of methodologies to reduce those collisions. And then also there's a workforce component to this also. And then also there's some other things in looking at and helping states to really improve and seek mitigation measures, again, to be able to reduce the accidents and collisions with wildlife. There's also some other safety related provisions here. I know you all have heard about the improvements to the manual on uniform traffic control devices. I can't talk about that too much because a lot of that information has been posted for federal comment on the Federal Register, but again, there's some major updates that are part of the bill that we're working on right now to make sure, again, that we improve things in terms of the traffic control devices and really work to modernize the system as well as improve the major safety components tied to that. And that's a major component as part of the safe system approach also. In terms of the workforce, and you've heard the US DOT as well as Federal Highway talk about just some of the improvements that we wanted to do in terms of the workforce. Obviously, this bill has some major provisions in terms of the Davis-Bacon wage requirement laws to make sure those folks that are working on the projects are receiving fair wages. The other thing is this bill did improve the Buy America provisions and really cleaned up those things in terms of the Buy American waivers and in terms of what's eligible, in terms of the Buy America requirements, et cetera. We're still working through the guidance, and right now we're on a temporary guidance, I think through December of this year. So stay tuned on more as far as what we're getting ready to do with the Buy America requirements. But again, the bipartisan infrastructure law did bring some clarity as far as what's required in the eligibility in terms of Buy America. I know for those that were working with state DOTs or contractors and others that were actually had some waivers submitted, there's been delays or holds on those waivers over the last few years. So with the guidance that was issued by OMB and the things that we're working on, we should be able to provide some more clarity in terms of the Buy America waivers. The other workforce provisions, this was a pilot is part of the FAST Act, but the local hiring preference is now permitted as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it does allow states to implement local hiring preferences based on geographic and economic considerations, and also requires that DOT submit a workforce diversity report to Congress. So stay tuned on that. I know there are several states around the country that are interested and had been asking about the local hiring preference. And we'll talk about that a little bit more and just in terms of the emphasis, but making sure that these projects, as they're starting to move forward, that they're meeting a diverse workforce, and that the folks that are being impacted by these projects are actually able to acquire jobs. So that's another emphasis area, as well as workforce development and training. We do have our on-the-job training supportive services that's being plussed up also as part of the provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law. In terms of climate and resiliency, there is the carbon reduction program. This is a formula program which provides funding to reduce transportation emissions, and also the development of the carbon reduction strategies. Some more detail has just come out on the carbon reduction program. I'll point you at the end of this presentation to our website where you can find out more, but stay tuned here. We'll have more as far as what we're doing, as far as what we're asking each state to do in terms of being able to track some of the greenhouse gases and seeing what impacts our industry is having in terms of carbon reduction. The Protect Formula program is another new program as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Again, the purpose there is planning and resiliency improvement, and community resilience and evacuation routes, as well as at-risk coastal infrastructure. This is roughly about $7.3 billion in contract authority through the life of the projects. States are eligible for this. And again, this is a formula program. So stay tuned. This is scheduled to be launched later this year with some more detail and guidance as far as how those dollars are going to be spent and allocated to state DOTs. There is a discretionary arm as part of the Protect grants. Again, same purpose as the formula program. This is roughly about $1.4 billion in contract authority through the Highway Trust Fund. And you can see here with the Protect grants, the eligibilities have expanded beyond just the state DOTs. Excuse me. We have MPOs, locals, tribes, and other folks are eligible to apply for these grants. And again, not just the construction in terms of resiliency, but what states, locals, and others are doing in terms of being able to plan to help to make our infrastructure more resilient. Again, another new program, which is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Program. This is for the deployment of the EV charging, and as well as the hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling infrastructure along the designated alternative fuel corridors and in communities. This is roughly about $2.5 billion. Again, eligible entities were similar to the Protect when you have states, MPOs, and others are eligible to apply for this. And then when you look at the projects, this is for the acquisition and installation of publicly accessible EV charging and alternative fuel infrastructure. There are some criteria where they have to be located within a mile of the interstate system. These have to be, there has to be an equity component tied to the EV charging stations, among other things. So again, states will be submitting their EV plans to US DOT Federal Highway August 1st. We'll be reviewing and approving those plans, and then we'll be ready to move this program forward here over the next few years. Again, this is the National EV formula, and this is for the strategic deployment. So the other ones were tied to the charging station, and this is, again, dollars, developing the plan, and then as far as the overall strategic deployment to make sure we have a overall network contained to make sure, again, the EV system is reliable as we start to expand the electric vehicles. So again, $5 billion in this, in advance appropriations for the general fund. With this does just go to state DOTs. And this is handled similar to the way our federal aid highway program is handled. So again, a lot of investment into the EV charging stations and as far as the emphasis areas. And again, this ties into a couple of key areas with US DOT, specifically in climate change and resiliency. And then the next one, which is also a new program, is the congestion relief program, a discretionary program. And again, this is to advance innovative, integrated, multimodal solutions to reduce congestion in our most congested metropolitan areas. Roughly about $250 million in contract authorities. The eligibility is expanded with this discretionary program with states, MPOs, cities, and municipalities being eligible. And then again, this is for planning, design, and implementation and construction activities to achieve the program goals of really congestion relief throughout the country. And here's some of the other climate and resiliency provisions that Congress has included as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, as far as setting standards for EV charging stations, reporting on the emerging alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure, and then also requiring a condition and performance report to address the resiliency needs. And one of the things that we're working on from a federal highway standpoint is really taking another look at how we're defining resiliency. Is it just, tied to areas where we're having what we call climate impacts? And what I mean by that are in terms of mudslides, hurricanes, et cetera, or should we be really expanding the definition of resiliency to really make sure our overall system is able to handle things in terms of shock to the system? And so that's one of the things to stay tuned for in the future as we really look at those resiliency provisions that are tied to the bipartisan infrastructure law. In terms of the bridges, and I touched on this a little bit, in terms of the bridge formula program, there is the new bridge formula program, which is to replace, rehabilitate, preserve, and protect and construct the bridges on our public road systems. As most of you know, this is probably from an infrastructure standpoint been one of our biggest needs. Both our urban as well as our rural, interstate, and non-interstate bridges have been suffering in terms of state of good repair. So this is why initially when we first got dollars for the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we were still waiting for the continuing resolution to be passed by Congress and then really to get the full year's funding, Congress really wanted us to move forward with moving these bridge dollars into the system. So the bridge formula program, as well as the other bridge program, were one of the first ones out the gate. So you can see here, over the next 5 years, roughly about $27.5 billion in funding for this. And I talked about this a little bit, but the benefits here and what the state DOTs have to identify is where they're putting the dollars for these all-system non-federal aid highway bridge projects. And so you can see here that 15% of funds have to be reserved for off-system bridges, and then 100% federal share if they're owned by a local agency or federally recognized tribes. Again, making sure these dollars are really being invested in these programs to help these local and rural communities to really improve their bridge assets and to make sure, again, we're bringing things to a state of good repair. The Bridge Investment Program, which was just recently launched, is a non-formula, it's a discretionary program, again, with the same scope, which is to improve the bridges as well as culvert condition, safety, efficiency, and reliability. Again, $12.5 billion in funding. And you can see the funding breakdown in terms of contract authority and advance appropriations from Congress. There's expanded eligibility here in terms of states, MPOs, local governments, also special purpose districts, again, to improve the bridges that are part of the National Bridge Inventory. So with this program, you have to be part of the MBI to be eligible for these dollars. And again, the state DOTs around the country are working to put together their packages for this discretionary program. There are some other related bridge provisions as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. One of the big things, and one of the things I talked about in the beginning, is that safety is really permeated throughout this reauthorization. And so you can see that when we talk about things in terms of structures. So when we look at the bridges now, so their state DOTs and locals should be looking at accommodations for bikes and peds on bridges. And so again, making sure when we're looking at existing infrastructure, as well as future bridge projects, is that we're making sure we have that connectivity in terms of the shared use paths, so we don't have these gaps in terms of our structures and not being able to accommodate bike and ped movements. The other thing we did is update the bridge terminology. And I know a lot of you have heard about that, and replacing the structurally deficient with in poor condition. There was a lot of confusion as far as the term structurally deficient. What that sounded like to a lot of people is that the bridge was getting ready to fall down. And so one of the things we try to do is bring clarity in that terminology, and just in terms of making sure the public understood that when we talk about the bridge condition, we say it's in poor condition versus structurally deficient, because it does sound like it's getting ready to fall. In terms of the wildlife habitat connectivities, there's some provisions there, as well as the National Culvert Removal, Replacement, and Restoration Grants. And just again, being able to get some provisions to be able to improve some of the culverts that are longer interstate and non-interstate systems. In terms of equity, and I'll touch on this a little bit more with the Reconnecting Communities pilot program that is, and actually is just been launched. But the purpose here is, and I talked about that, is you hear a lot from Secretary Buttigieg, you heard a lot from Secretary Fox in the previous administration, under the Obama administration, just really talking about how our highway infrastructure really split communities. And that was done in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and some would say that's even happening now. So what this pilot program is set out to do is really restore the community connectivities and really putting those dollars to help these local communities really be able to make the investments needed to be able to make those things happening. So for example, in Richmond here, Jackson Ward is a great example of a project that's looking to reconnect to where, we had I-95 that divided that community back in the 60s. And so, there's been an effort now with that local community to be able to restore the connectivity. So that's a great example of what these dollars are intended for. And again, roughly about $1 billion. And there's eligibility in terms of planning grants. And I'll talk about a little bit as far as who's eligible, et cetera. But again, that's the purpose of this. That falls under the equity umbrella. There's a lot of discussion in the US DOT's Equity Action Plan, and you'll hear more about that in the J40, but how we as at Federal Highway are really looking to make sure those investments are needed to really emphasize really reconnecting these communities and helping to put those dollars forward. The next, another discretionary grant, again, tied to equity, but not just looking at the urbanized area, but really to looking to expand and improve the surface transportation infrastructure in our rural areas and to be able to improve community connectivity, safety, reliability, in terms of people, freight movement, helping to improve economic development. This is a multimodal approach. It's not just highway infrastructure, but when we're looking at things in terms of transit, bike paths, other mobility options to make sure those dollars are set aside, and state DOTs, local governments, et cetera, are really looking at the overall connectivity and safety in these rural projects. So this program, this discretionary program has not yet been launched, but again, this falls under the umbrella of really the administration's emphasis on equity. So when we look at where Virginia is in terms of the investment for the bipartisan infrastructure law and what will Virginia expect over the next 5 years. So roughly about $70 billion or $7 billion in federal aid highway apportion programs. Of that, 537 million for bridge replacement and repairs. And Commissioner and the Secretary are doing a good job of making those investments happen in Virginia. They've ID'd the projects that they want to move forward over the next 5 years, or at least starting that process. And we're working hand in hand with them to really get these things moving. But as I mentioned at the beginning, there's more to it than just the highway bridge side. There's another $1.2 billion to improve public transportation options statewide, another $106 million for the expansion of the EV charging network. There's that $100 million that's available for broadband coverage. This is a big emphasis area. And when we talk about equity, both in the urban areas, as well as our rural areas, making sure everybody has equitable access to broadband is important. So Virginia will be getting its fair share with that minimum allocation of $100 million to improve the broadband coverage. There's also $15 million in terms of protection against wildfires. Again, this in terms of resiliency, $21 million for cyber attacks. And then you look at the water infrastructure, and then finally, $386 million for airports. So though I spent a lot of this presentation talking about the federal highway, because that's my area of emphasis, the dollars in terms of bipartisan infrastructure law, the administration really wanted to make sure we were really taking a full look at our infrastructure in terms of clean water, wastewater, broadband, airports, rail, transportation, transit, et cetera. So a lot of emphasis area and a lot of good opportunities for Virginia. So where does this all tie in? And one of the things I talked about is throughout this presentation is looking at safety and then equity and climate and sustainability. So earlier this year, Secretary Buttigieg put together USDOT's departmental priorities. And this is tied to our strategic plan. And you can see the lifespan of that is over the 5 years of the bipartisan infrastructure law. But as you look at these priorities in terms of safety, which we call kind of our guiding light, our North Star, and then things, and where the other one is economic strength and global competitiveness, equity, climate and sustainability, transformation, and then organizational excellence. These are the strategic priorities that USDOT, Federal Highway, and the other sister agencies are really going to be operating under. And really, these are the emphasis areas as we really launch this year and then over the next 4.5 years into the bipartisan infrastructure law. So when you hear us talking about safety and the national road strategy, things in terms of equity, climate and sustainability, economic strength in terms of job creation, transformation, and what we're doing in terms of the reconnected community and the organizational excellence, which we're doing at USDOT, this is the tie-in to where the dollars are going and really kind of our guiding light to how we really deliver the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we can touch on that a little bit later if you all have any questions. What I want to do is just conclude and talk about the two discretionary grant programs that are out now. The first one is the Safe Streets and Roads for All. This is a key program when I talk about safety being that guiding light and making sure we put the investment and time to making sure we at USDOT Federal Highway are making sure we're making the investments necessary to be able to improve safety for our nation highway, and then for the users. This is one of the key programs that we launched. So this is $1 billion in annual funding that supports the local initiatives to prevent deaths and serious injuries on our roads and streets. And this helps us to really get towards our Vision Zero or towards zero death initiatives. So you can see here, and I touched on this a little bit in terms of the eligibility. You can see the eligible recipients in terms of MPOs, the political subdivisions of state DOTs are not eligible, as I said earlier, and then the tribes as well as multi-jurisdictional groups comprised of the entities above. So again, this is allowing those dollars to be able to go to the local communities to improve safety. And the eligible activities are development of the comprehensive safety action plan, conduct any planning, design, and development activities, as well as carry out projects and strategies identified in the action plan. So you can see here in terms of the funding, again, I touched on it a little bit, about $1 billion annual. There's a cost share and a match to that. And then you can see here, not more than 15% of the funds can be awarded to projects in a single state in a given fiscal year. So the intent here is to make sure we're spreading out the dollars, and that each state, if they submit one, or well, each local entity within a state, is that they throughout the 5 years, they have projects that can be part of the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. The next one that I want to touch on in terms of the, and this discretionary grant is also out now. I think it just came out about a week or so ago. This is the Reconnecting Communities. And really why I want to touch on this also, because we get a lot of questions on what does that mean? So you can see here just in terms of the pictures, and so what can we do in terms of looking at projects? What can locals do? And I talked about the Jackson Ward here in Richmond, Virginia, to make sure we have that community reconnectivity again. So making communities walkable, making sure our kids can get to school safely, they're bikeable. We can do other things within the communities. So that's the intent of that reconnected community. What the overall goal is trying to right some of the wrongs that were done as part of our transportation program. So there is a Reconnecting Community pilot program. This is that discretionary grant program that I talked about a little bit earlier. You can see the funding available each fiscal year for planning as well as capital construction. So for those entities that are looking to start the planning process, there's dollars there throughout those 5 years. And those that are ready to really launch their projects forward in terms of capital improvements, there's dollars there. And you can see that that $1 billion that I talked about in terms of the total authorized amount over the 5 years. So the eligible transportation facilities, and this was put into statute as far as what's eligible is just beyond the highway bridges that connect the communities. The intent here is, and you look at the pictures, and that's why I want to really include these, but there, we know railroads separated our community. So when, you always hear the terminology, other side of the tracks. So yeah, that's real. So what can we do to make those improvements to have community connectivities? The same with pipelines, airports. So again, these are the type of projects that are going to be eligible for these Reconnecting Community grants. And you'll be seeing more on that over these next few weeks in terms of states and locals really starting to apply for these grants and starting to move these projects forward. And so I'll conclude with just, there's more information on the bipartisan infrastructure law. I mean, I can probably talk about this for days, but this was just a quick overview for you. And now I'm open for questions.
This is Iris Leoncio from Moffett Nichols. I'm also the program's committee chair here at WTS Central Virginia. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Here in Zoom, you can look at the bottom of your screen and there's a reactions icon, and you can click raise hand or just post on the chat window. So first question, Mr. Nelson, is if you're willing to share your presentation with the attendees.
Yes.
Okay, so so if you're interested in getting a copy of Mr. Nelson's slides, just email me at ileoncio@moffatnichol.com or centralva@wtsinternational.org, and we'll send a copy your way. Okay, so the next question is, does the SSA funding support construction or does it support only planning?
Yes, there is a component that does support construction also. So what'll happen is some entities will just apply for the planning grant just to walk through what they're going to be doing. You can't, if you don't have a planning grant already established, so some entities have already developed their planning grants, so they'll be ready to move forward in terms of capital constructions. For those that do not have the framework for the planning grants, there's dollars there so that those entities can develop that and then move forward into capital improvements.
Does anyone else have any question? I'm looking at the or just feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask your question. I'm not seeing anyone else. Okay, so we have another question here. Does funding for construction continue past 2026?
Yeah, there will be some programs that will be funded past 2026. And that's just due to the case that some programs have not been authorized as part of Congress Appropriations Act. So once those are funded, yeah, there will be some that are beyond 2026. It's just a matter of the obligation of the dollars.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Everyone's good? Okay, we have another question here. So you mentioned that there are several progressive new initiatives and programs. How do you see them improving transportation and access?
Well, a couple of things. So one of the big things you always hear is put your money where your mouth is. And so that's one of the things that this bill does in terms of the overall investment and the increase in the investment. One of the things that's going to happen is, and when you look at, and I talked about this a little bit in terms of the Justice 40. So when you talk about equity, and part of that is there's a 40% of the benefits should go to the disadvantaged communities. So that's part of the J40 initiative. And there are some programs that are highlighted as part of that. Congress said, okay, if there's projects tied to sustainability, greenhouse gases, other improvements, those projects have to be part of J40. So what we've done is identify those, and then that information will be written into the guidance to make sure there's equity components as well as climate change components as part of those programs. The other things with these discretionary programs, to be able, as part of these discretionary grants, there is a equity section, climate change section, et cetera, that are tied to those actual programs. So the applicant has to be able to explain how their programs or how their projects will really benefit things in terms of safety, equity, and climate change. So we've actually built that in to the discretionary programs.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question. Is FHWA able to support local governments and comply with federal regulation, who comply with the federal regulations without the assistance of state DOTs, since they will become direct recipients?
Yeah, so great question. Yeah, there are going to be situations where the direct recipients will be working directly with Federal Highway Administration to move those grants forward. They will be seen as part of these grants as similar to how we've been working with the state DOTs over the years. Now, as part of these, some of these direct recipients may, as part of their contract or part of their projects, quote unquote, hire on or work with a state DOT as a program manager to be able to help them deliver that. So there may be some of that. We don't know how that's going to play out yet because we're just going through this first round of discretionary grant programs. But you're right, that is going to be one of our biggest challenges right now, because we are going to have a lot of new non-traditional folks into the direct recipient category. That's actually good news because they'll be able to get those dollars directly and be able to put the dollars to their local projects. But there'll be some challenges there, and opportunities also for some other entities to be able to work with us directly to be able to deliver the program. So what we don't want to do is, because these now are direct recipients, is put the burden on a respective state DOT, similar to when they were sub-recipients.
So you can
answers the question.
Okay, so FHWA will work directly and assist local governments. Okay.
Yes.
With the process and compliance with regulations. Okay.
Yes, that is correct.
All right, thank you. And another question: what advice would you give for writing federal grants? And what should the grants focus on most other than the NOFO information?
What I will point you to for that question is grants.gov. They have a lot of good information in terms of what technical assistance, and I'll make sure I get that over to you all when I send the presentation, because each NOFO is different. Now, as I mentioned before, there are going to be some components where the applicant has to respond to how their project is going to assist in terms of safety, equity, climate change resiliency. So those things are going to be there within the grants, but some of these grants are going to have their own particulars. What I would do is look at that particular NOFO and then go into grants.gov, and they'll be able to provide you whatever technical assistance or capacity building that your local entity or state, or because there's a lot of state DOTs that are going to need that technical assistance also. But that'll be really the avenue for you to get whatever information you want as far as applying for a particular grant.
Okay, so grants.gov. Okay, anyone else has a question for Mr. Nelson? We still have 4 minutes before the top of the hour. Yes, yes, we will have this recording available, and just like with the slides, with a copy of the slides, just email us for more information and the link for that. So if no one else has any questions, okay, so we have a message here. So we will post a video on WTS Central Virginia's YouTube channel. Okay, so I guess that concludes our event for today. Thank you so much, Mr. Nelson, for sharing your overview of the programs under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I really appreciate it. And I would also just like to thank some of our members who helped make this event possible. That would be Muriel Rodriguez from Schnabel, the one who spoke earlier, Unwana Dabney from Wilpert, Alexa Overeem from Schnabel, and Taylor Jenkins from your PT. So, and thank you everyone for attending. We hope to see you again in our next event in August for the EV infrastructure series. And that would be virtual, and our annual reception in September at the Virginia War Memorial. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.